Only Frank and Jesse James, who had split up with the rest of the gang after leaving Northfield, were able to escape. The brothers traveled with their families to Nashville, Tennessee, where they assumed new identities. They tried to go straight, and Frank, at least, seemed to adjust to a quieter life, despite the constant fear of being found out. But within a few years, Jesse returned to Missouri, formed a new gang, and returned to the life he knew so well. His new gang included the brothers Charles and Robert Ford. Robert, 20 years old, had made a deal with Missouri Governor Thomas Crittenden to collect the bounty for the death or capture of Jesse James. The Ford brothers were living with Jesse, giving them a unique opportunity. Jesse was going in and out of the house, preparing for another robbery. It was a hot day, and Jesse removed his coat. Not wanting to arouse suspicions among his neighbors, he also removed his guns. At one point, Jesse noticed a dusty picture hanging on a wall. As he cleaned the picture, his back to the Fords, Robert Ford shot him in the back of the head. 5 months later, Frank James surrendered to Governor Crittenden, preferring to stand trial rather than spend the rest of his life waiting for a friend to shoot him in the back. Frank was tried for 2 of the robberies and murders that he was believed to have committed. But in the wake of Jesse's death, Frank James was a sympathetic character. His defense team was able to establish reasonable doubt, and Frank was acquitted. 20 years later, after Cole Younger was released from prison, he and Frank began a short-lived tour, the Great Cole Younger and Frank James Historical Wild West Show. It lasted less than a year. The Younger brothers were not the only famed outlaws in their family. Their cousins, Bill, Grat, Bob, and Emmett Dalton, formed the infamous Dalton Gang. The Daltons actually began as lawmen. Their oldest brother was a deputy U.S. Marshal under Judge Isaac Parker in the Oklahoma Territory. Isaac Parker had been a Missouri congressman and was nominated by President Ulysses Grant in 1875 to be the U.S. District Judge, presiding over the U.S. District Court for the Western District of Arkansas. Judge Parker would sit on that bench for 21 years, ruling on over 13,000 criminal cases. He sentenced 160 to death and was nicknamed the Hangin' Judge. Judge Parker himself was actually opposed to the death penalty, but federal law required executions for those convicted of rape or murder. Judge Parker's jurisdiction included the Indian Territory, modern-day Oklahoma. In the territory, the Native American tribal courts had authority over Native American offenders, but no authority over non-Native offenders. Judge Parker appointed numerous lawmen to serve as his deputy marshals who could bring those offenders to justice. These included men like Frank Pistol Pete Eaton, who at age 15 outshot the best marksman at Fort Gibson, earning his nickname. He was made a deputy U.S. Marshal by Judge Parker when he was just 17, so that he could hunt down the men who had murdered his father. He remained in law enforcement for decades. Bass Reeves was the first African American to be made a deputy U.S. Marshal. Born a slave in 1838, Bass Reeves escaped during the Civil War and went to live in the Indian Territory among the Creek and the Seminole. When Judge Parker was looking for deputies, Reeves' knowledge of the Indian Territory and ability to speak multiple Indian languages made him a perfect choice. A crack shot with a pistol or rifle, he remained in law enforcement for the rest of his life. And another deputy U.S. Marshal under Judge Parker was Frank Dalton. Frank was killed by outlaws in 1887. And for a short time, his younger brothers, Grat, Bob, and Emmett, followed in his footsteps, with both Grat and Bob becoming deputy U.S. Marshals and Emmett occasionally serving on their posses. But when he was just 19, Bob Dalton killed a man. He claimed it was in the line of duty, but the dead man was known to be a rival with Bob for a woman. Within a few months, he was charged with smuggling liquor into the Indian Territory, and his brother Grat was charged with stealing horses. They jumped bail and soon formed the Dalton Gang. They collected other outlaws and started robbing trains. Then, in October 1892, they attempted a daring robbery, intending to hit 2 banks at once in broad daylight in Coffeyville, Kansas. This episode, even more so than the James Younger Gang's disastrous robbery in Northfield, Minnesota, demonstrates yet another kind of lawman in the West, the vigilante. Common citizens of the town who took up arms to defend themselves and each other when outlaws struck. 30 years earlier, a band of Confederate guerrillas, led by William Quantrill, tore through Lawrence, Kansas, pulling unarmed citizens from their homes and shooting them in the streets. The Dalton brothers were too young to fight in the Civil War like their cousins, the Youngers, who were part of Quantrill's raiders. But their outlaw tactics had their roots in those used by the murderous guerrilla bands that plagued Kansas during the war. But by 1892, those tactics were no longer a surprise. And in Coffeyville, 1892, the citizens who faced the Dalton brothers were neither unarmed nor helpless.
After crossing the pavement, the men quickened their pace, and the 3 in the front file went into C.M. Condon and Company's bank at the southwest door, while the 2 in the rear ran directly across the street to the First National Bank and entered the front door of that institution. An observer was almost transfixed with horror. He had an uninterrupted view of the inside of Condon and Company's bank, and the first thing that greeted his vision was a Winchester in the hands of one of the men pointed towards the cashier's counter in the bank. He quickly recovered his lost wits and called out to the men in the store that the bank is being robbed. Persons at different points on the plaza heard the cry, and it was taken up and quickly passed around the square. At the same time, several gentlemen saw the 2 men enter the First National Bank. They gave the alarm on the east side of the plaza. A call to arms came simultaneously with the alarm, and in less time than it takes to relate the fact, a dozen men with Winchesters and revolvers in their hands were ready to resist the escape of the unwelcome visitors.
At the Condon Bank, a teller fooled the gang into believing that there was a 10-minute time lock on the vault. The gang decided to wait it out.
Just at this critical juncture, the citizens opened fire from the outside of the bank, and the shots from their Winchesters and shotguns pierced the plate glass windows and rattled around in the bank. The battle then began in earnest. Evidently recognizing that the fight was on, Grat Dalton asked whether there was a back door through which they could get to the street. He was told there was none. He then ordered Mr. Ball and Mr. Carpenter to carry the sack of money to the front door. Reaching the hall on the outside of the counter, the firing of the citizens through the windows became so terrific and the bullets whistled so close around their heads that the robbers and both bankers retreated to the back room again. Just then, one at the south door was heard to exclaim, "I am shot. I can't use my arm. It's no use. I can't shoot anymore."
At the First National Bank, things weren't going any better for the Daltons.
Bob Dalton ordered the 3 bankers to walk out from behind the counter in front of him, and they put the whole party out at the front door. Before they reached the door, Emmett called to Bob to look out there at the left. Just as the bankers and their customers had reached the pavement, and as Bob and Emmett appeared at the door, 2 shots were fired at them from the doorway of the drugstore. Neither one of them was hit. They were driven back into the bank. Bob stepped to the door a second time and, raising his Winchester to his shoulder, took deliberate aim and fired in a southerly direction. Emmett held his Winchester under his arm while he tied a string around the mouth of the sack containing the money. They then ordered the young men to open the back door and let them out. Mr. Shepard complied and went with them to the rear of the building when they passed out into the alley. It was then that the bloody work of the dread desperados began. The moment that Grat Dalton and his companions, Dick Broadwell and Bill Power, left the Condon Bank, they came under the guns of the men in Isham's store. Grat Dalton and Bill Powers each received mortal wounds before they had retreated 20 steps. The dust was seen to fly from their clothes, and Powers, in his desperation, attempted to take refuge in the rear doorway of an adjoining store, but the door was locked, and no one answered his request to be let in. He kept his feet and clung to his Winchester until he reached his horse, when another ball struck him in the back, and he fell dead at the feet of the animal that had carried him on his errand of robbery. Grat Dalton, getting under cover of the oil tank, managed to reach the side of the barn that stands on the south side of the alley. The marshal sprang into the alley with his face towards the point where the horses were hitched. This movement brought him with his back to the murderous Dalton, who was seen to raise his Winchester to his side and, without taking aim, fire a shot into the back of the brave officer. Marshal Connolly fell forward on his face within 20 feet of where his murderer stood. Dick Broadwell, in the meantime, had reached cover in the Long Bell Lumber Company's yards, where he laid down for a few moments. He was wounded in the back. A lull occurred in the firing after Grat Dalton and Bill Power had fallen. Broadwell took advantage of this and crawled out of his hiding place and mounted his horse and rode away. A ball from John Clower's rifle and a load of shot from the gun in the hands of Carey Seaman overtook him before he had ridden 20 feet. Bleeding and dying, he clung to his horse and passed out of the city. His dead body was subsequently found alongside of the road a half-mile west of the city. When Bob and Emmett Dalton reached the junction of the alleys, they discovered F.D. Benson in the act of climbing through a rear window with a gun in his hand. Divining his object, Bob fired at him point blank at a distance of not over 30 feet. The shot missed Mr. Benson, but struck a window and demolished the glass. Bob then stepped into the alley and glanced up towards the tops of the buildings, as if he suspected that the shots that were being fired at the time were coming from that direction. As he did so, the men at Isham's took deliberate aim at him from their position in the store and fired. The notorious leader of the Dalton gang evidently received a severe, if not fatal, wound at this moment. He staggered across the alley and sat down on a pile of dressed curbstones near the city jail. True to his desperate nature, he kept his rifle in action and fired several shots from where he was seated. His aim was unsteady and the bullets went wild. He arose to his feet and sought refuge alongside of an old barn west of the city jail, and leaning against the southwest corner, brought his rifle into action again and fired 2 shots in the direction of his pursuers. A ball from Mr. Clower's rifle struck the bandit full in the breast, and he fell upon his back among the stones that covered the ground where he was standing. After shooting Marshal Conley, Grat Dalton made another attempt to reach his horse. Turning his face to his pursuers, he again attempted to use his Winchester. John Clower's rifle spoke in unmistakable tones another time, and the oldest member of the band dropped with a bullet in his throat and a broken neck. Emmett Dalton had managed to escape unhurt up to this time. He kept under shelter after he reached the alley until he attempted to mount his horse. A half-dozen rifles sent their contents in the direction of his person as he undertook to get into the saddle. Emmett succeeded in getting into the saddle, but not until he had received a shot through the right arm and one through the left hip and groin. During all this time, he had clung to the sack containing the money they had taken from the First National Bank. Instead of riding off, as he might have done, Emmett boldly rode back to where Bob Dalton was lying and, reaching down his hand, attempted to lift his dying brother on the horse with him. Just then, Carey Seaman fired the contents of both barrels of his shotgun into Emmett's back. He dropped from his horse, carrying the sack containing over $20,000 with him, and both fell near the feet of Bob, who expired a moment thereafter.
The Daltons had begun their careers as lawmen, but died as outlaws under vigilante fire. The Dalton switch from lawmen to outlaw was not as unusual an occurrence as you might think. The politics of the day were still affected by old Civil War allegiances. In the former Confederate states and some of the border states, there were many acts of violence taken to further political causes. Often, these were undertaken by former Confederate soldiers or their younger brothers and sons as members of the Ku Klux Klan or similar paramilitary groups, attacking Republican officials and African Americans who tried to take advantage of their new freedoms. But in the Lincoln County War in New Mexico, the politics wasn't about party, it was about money. On one side were the merchants and businessmen, led by Lawrence Murphy, who owned an enormous mercantile store in Lincoln County called The House. Along with James Dolan, he virtually ran Lincoln County, including its sheriff, William Brady. On the other side was an Englishman named John Tunstall, who partnered with attorney Alexander McSween and rancher John Chisholm to develop a cattle ranch, store, and bank. The two sides struggled, in particular, over the federal contract selling beef to forts and the Indian agencies. Murphy and Dolan, rumored to get much of their beef from rustlers, had a lock on the government contract. They had a sweet deal, and they resisted attempts to encroach on it violently. Sheriff Brady rounded up a posse, which included members of multiple outlaw gangs, to seize Tunstall's assets. When Tunstall argued, the posse killed him in cold blood. In response, Tunstall's cowhands formed a group called the Regulators to bring his killers to justice. They were deputized by the local justice of the peace and set off after the members of the sheriff's posse with legally issued warrants. Both sides claimed to be representing the law, and both sides were willing to be judge, jury, and executioner. When the Regulators captured two of the men who killed Tunstall, their leader promised the men would be taken alive to Lincoln County to stand trial. But at least one member of the Regulators wasn't willing to trust Lincoln County justice, and he killed both prisoners, and even one of his fellow Regulators, whom he believed was helping them. Their killer was a young man called by many names and aliases over his lifetime, but he was most famously called Billy the Kid. Born William Henry McCarthy, Jr. in 1859, the man who would call himself William Bonney and would be called Billy the Kid by everyone else, was one of the most celebrated outlaws of the West. By the time he was 16, he was living as a fugitive in Arizona Territory, though for relatively minor offenses. But while there, he killed a man, perhaps in self-defense, though the coroner's inquest ruled the shooting unjustifiable. He fled to the New Mexico Territory, where he took up cattle rustling, and he called himself William H. Bonney. In 1877, he was hired as a cattle guard by John Tunstall. Tunstall seemed to have taken a liking to young Billy, a fact that likely enraged Billy all the more when Tunstall was murdered by Sheriff Brady's posse. Territorial Governor Samuel Axtell decided that the Lincoln County Justice of the Peace, who had deputized the Regulators, had been improperly appointed by the county commissioners. Suddenly, the Regulators were not deputies, but an outlaw gang themselves. In response, Billy and other members of the Regulators ambushed the Sheriff Brady and his deputy, killing them in the street. The continuing, rising violence on both sides eventually convinced much of the public that the regulators were as bloodthirsty as Murphy and Dolan's gangs. And when the Lincoln County War finally ended, the new governor, Lew Wallace, offered amnesty for everyone involved who was not already under indictment. Billy, however, was under indictment, but he contacted the governor and worked out a promise to grant amnesty for Billy in exchange for his testimony. However, the local district attorney didn't feel bound by the governor's promise and refused to free Billy after he testified. Billy escaped and spent the next year and a half as a fugitive. Then, in December 1880, he began to be hunted by the new sheriff of Lincoln County, Pat Garrett. And what finally brought about the end of the Wild West that provided lawmen as formidable as Wyatt Earp, as flashy as Wild Bill Hickok, and as duplicitous as the Daltons? All this and more as we take a final look at the Lawmen of the West.
Thanks for watching. If you'd like to help us produce more compelling historical content like this, please like, comment below, and share this video with fellow history buffs. And of course, be sure to subscribe to help keep history happening.